Conflicts are everywhere and conflicts can happen anytime. Sometimes we don't know how to resolve a conflict and sometimes we do the wrong things and make the conflict even bigger. Today, I have a very special guest. Maybe you know that I've been debating for over 10 years and he has been debating over 10 years as well. But in difference to me, he is a two-time debating world champion. And today we're going to talk about his new book. It's called Good Arguments. And in this book, he has an innovative model that has to do something with debating. Bo Seo is my guest. Bo, I'm very happy that you're here today.
Wlad, it's a pleasure to be on your program. Thank you.
Let's make it super easy. Just yesterday, I heard about a conflict of my coaching client. He wanted to go on holiday in the last 2 weeks of August, and his colleague also wanted to go on holiday in exactly the same last 2 weeks in August. Unfortunately for both of them, the boss has told them, you figure out between yourselves, but at least one person I would need, and you both cannot go at the same time. So how should they deal with this type of conflict?
Well, for me, very good debaters know to make good arguments, but the best debaters know when to pick an argument and when to skip it, right? That's even within an argument, which points are you contesting and which are you letting go? And one of the frameworks that I developed in writing this book is how do you choose your battles? And it's by asking yourself 4 questions before launching into a disagreement. And it's called the RISA checklist, R-I-S-A. Is the disagreement real? Is it important enough to justify the disagreement? Is it specific enough that you're going to be able to make some progress? And are the 2 sides aligned in their objectives for wanting to be in the disagreement? So to take that one at a time, the starting place is to ask whether it is in fact a real disagreement. And even though in the setup that you outlined, it's quite clear cut, actually in the workplace or around the kitchen table or just around with our friends or with family, it's often a bit unclear, right? We're not explicit about what we want and what we need. So sometimes it can feel like rather than saying, wow, there really is a scheduling conflict here, people can kind of be like, oh, I'd rather you not did that, or dropping all these hints about, south of France is beautiful at this time of year. And so the starting place for having a good disagreement is naming the disagreement, just so you can check that it is real, right? So rather than saying, I'd like to go away sometime in August, say, well, what are the dates? And is there an actual conflict here? Is it right that the company can't afford to have both of us away? So the first thing is make sure there's a real disagreement. And while you're doing that, you don't have to be on opposite sides, right? You can be working it out together to just figure out, hey, can we check that there is a real disagreement here before we go off into our camps and argue about it? So I think the first thing is there a real disagreement, or are you reacting out of a misunderstanding or defensiveness or pride or something like that? So once you've checked that, then you ask yourself, is it important enough to justify the dispute, right? And here, it's a quality of judgment to say, do you want to pick this particular fight now? Do you want to have this particular argument now? And it may well be that there are going to be accommodations your boss is going to have to make for you in the future, or you're going to have to share with your colleagues down the line. And it may well be that you say, well, even if it's going to be a little bit disadvantageous for me not to go on vacation at this time, or maybe a little bit not embarrassing, but it reduces the ego to give up a disagreement there and then, you might say, well, there's something else that's more important to me. So that's always one opportunity to get off the bus towards disagreement, is saying, this is just not important enough for me. The third is you want to be really specific about what you're disagreeing about, and you want to check that the disagreement is specific enough that you're going to be able to make progress. So where this would come into that example is you would say, this is just a disagreement about the scheduling conflict. It's not about whether we respect each other as colleagues. It's not about what your choice of vacation time says about you as a person. It's not about the health of our business. That's not on the table for the moment, right? And I think we've all been in these discussions where it starts off as a little thing, but all these other things get pulled in. And as you said in the introduction, this is one way in which we misstep, right? And one of the things that we're doing with disagreements is we're playing with fire in some ways. And as a result, it becomes really easy for it to spread unless we're careful about it. So by naming our dispute, saying this is what we're disagreeing about, you're also saying this is not what we're disagreeing about. And part of that is, I respect you as a colleague. I'm still a committed member of this team. I believe in the mission of the business. All those things are not on the table. This is just a scheduling conflict. So being specific and checking that the discussion is framed around a specific issue that you can resolve within the given time. And then the final thing is to check that the two sides are aligned in their objectives for having the disagreement. So one person isn't in there just to hurt the other person's feelings or to put them down or to reduce their standing in the company or something like that. You want to make sure that both sides are coming at it with the motivations they say they're acting on. And that is, in this instance, just the desire to give themselves and their families a good vacation. So, it's exactly as you said at the beginning. Debate is a method, and it's really a kind of a laboratory where you've seen so many of these disagreements that you start to see patterns, and I describe it as a kind of a physics of disagreement that emerges. And one of them, and this is one of the more sophisticated lessons, I think, is once you've learned how to make an argument, how to bring one down, how to sell it persuasively, you then have to be quite judicious about when you launch into a disagreement and when you don't. And I think the RISA checklist is a useful starting place for that.
Yeah, thanks for explaining those 4 steps. And now, of course, the audience wants us to test your RISA checklist. And let's make a case out of it that is not too far-fetched, but quite realistic, and introduce our 2 characters, Paul and Martha. And let's say that Paul got married a few weeks or months ago, and for him, this end of August 2-week thing would be a real kind of honeymoon where he wants to go to the south of France. So for him, that's definitely real that he wants to go. It's important. He is also not trying to hurt the colleague, but for him, it's also pretty specific because his wife has already found nice places and hotels for those just for those 2 weeks. And let's also introduce Martha, for whom it's also a pretty real and specific thing. So she also doesn't want to drain Paul into misery, but for her, it's a little bit different. She has already a child that's 4 years old. And the thing that she planned for her little family is to see that her child sees the Mediterranean Sea, let's say, in Italy for the very first time. And both people have, because they don't have enormous financial resources, for them it's also about, yeah, but we just found this for those 2 weeks and later we cannot go, or sooner it was more expected in July. Let's pretend that these are the financial constraints. And I think that's a pretty realistic case where everybody can imagine that this thing can happen. And unfortunately, I'm self-employed, but I know many people who are really employees, and for them, those 10 days, working days of vacation is like 50–60% of the vacation time of the whole year. So definitely that's an important topic for all of them. How would you, let's say we are Paul, you can pick Paul or Martha, the married guy or the child lady, what should he or she do? How should they introduce the conversation, and how can debate skills play a role in this specific case?
So the RISA checklist gets us to, is this a disagreement we're going to engage in or not? right? And it's not a guarantee that the disagreement is going to go well, but it is 4 conditions that I think at least give you a shot that the disagreement is going to go well. So we've now passed that stage. It feels like, as you said, we meet those. So then it's a question about how are we going to have the disagreement, right? And how are we going to do it in a way that's going to be productive as opposed to destructive? And I'd say 2 things about that. The first is debate encourages us to be very deliberate in how it is that we're having the conversation. So it matters what we're saying, where we're coming from, but what matters is how we're having the conversation. And I think in an instance like that, and with most people, and certainly with your listeners, people are quite reasonable, right? They know that they have needs, the other person has needs. We have different families, but they're, in some ways equally deserving of vacation. And where things start to go wrong is when people feel like their perspective is not being heard, right? So structure can help with that. So saying, we're going to give each other roughly equal time in this conversation, right? And we're going to take turns so you don't have to interrupt me, right? I'm going to say something, you're going to say something, but then I'm going to get a chance to respond. And giving that kind of protected time in which people can make their point and be heard, and they don't feel like they're, so rushed that they're not getting out their point properly, and they are giving themselves a kind of putting together a case in the way that you just did for each of those 2 characters. I think that can be really helpful. And even if you do lose, or if you don't get your way, feeling as though you had been heard, feeling as though the other person understands you better than before, feeling perhaps that you've put a case for some interest that you might be able to realize later on. All of those ways are ways of redefining success or taking a more expansive view of it, right? I think so once we've kind of given the structure to the way in which we're going to have the conversation, the next thing that I think can be helpful is to say, the way in which we're going to try and persuade each other is by making arguments, right? And an argument is not just any random thing that vaguely supports your view. It's not just emoting. It's not this kind of formless repetition of the things that you believe on a particular subject. It is a way of organizing your thinking so that you're justifying your ideas. You're presenting some evidence, right? You're making it feel real and making it feel important to the other side. And we can get into a little bit, if you like, but how I think about putting together arguments. But the choice in the first instance to think about how we're going to have the conversation, and within that to make arguments to each other, which is a particular way of talking, I think can be useful in that situation.
Yeah, and let me first come back, before we come back to arguments, to your first point where you spoke about this procedural setting where people get protected time. For both of us, this is something that's super obvious as debaters. We always got protected time where people couldn't ask a question, where people couldn't interrupt us. In the British parliamentary style, where we both participated in World Debating Championships, this is something that happens every day for us debaters, but in real life, that never happens, because in a standard meeting, people just walk over each other or talk over each other, especially when you are higher in the hierarchy, like some cluster or representative or high in the hierarchy. People tend to walk off or talk off and shut down other employees. And I think I just wanted to make this point, make it a little bit bigger for the real life conversation, that people could really take their phone, like literally take their smartphone and giving each other the time that they think is adequate, for instance, 5 minutes. And I will do it right now just to illustrate how easy it can be. So simply start the watch, and whatever timer you use, doesn't matter. After 5 minutes, this is your protected time, or 3 minutes or 10, however, or how the deeper the conflict, probably the more time people should have to present their case. And then you really both look at the timer, and you know those 5 minutes are protected. And this is something that we both learned in debate. We shouldn't really infringe upon this rule, but if we don't do and let the other person speak, then the other person feels heard. And this is maybe something you also mentioned at the beginning. So make it like a game even. So gamify your conflict and try to really address each other, and like you told us, take turns the same way we would do that in a debating round, just to make it a little bit more applicable. And to your second point, I really have a nice rebuttal, since we both are debaters. I'm sure you're gonna like mine, and maybe you've heard of it, where you said, when we have this setting, it's good to present arguments in a very specific logical way, where you present evidence and importance of your points. And for us in Europe, it's funny, in continental Europe, because we learned in school that the word argument has actually two meanings. The one meaning is this logical steps towards a certain claim. That's what you meant. And the second meaning is good argument is where people fight in an argument.
Yes.
And my rebuttal would be, and I'm sure you can respond to that, don't arguments lead to a bigger conflict slash argument? So don't we entangle through evidence and logic into a much larger war, not literal war, but metaphorical war, than if we would be a bit more emotive and tried to ask for a bit more empathy?
I like that a lot, and it's sparking a lot of thoughts. Just on the first thing about being deliberate, and I liked what you did with the phone. I think it's especially important among leaders, and if you're the leader of a business or an organization, you can often underestimate the influence or the effect that you have on people who are below you in the hierarchy, right? So I've heard a lot of very successful CEOs making sure in meetings that you go around and force people to have their say, right? So that everybody gets an equal time, and you're not getting so caught up in your own ideas that you're talking on top of everybody. Because that experience of speechlessness is actually quite a universal thing, right? It's what we experience first on the playground when there's someone more dominant, kind of silencing you, pushing you to the margins, but it's a feature of adult experience. It's a feature of family life, a feature of work life. And it does require something very deliberate, even if it's something like saying, just exiting the conversation for a second and just saying, hey, can we agree to hear each other out here? Can we agree that I should get as much time as you get? So before you continue with the conversation. On the second part, that's exactly right. And it's true in the English language too, right? So disagreeing sounds on one level like a skill, which is what I'm arguing for, that there's a skill to disagreement, but it's also a fact of life, right? So if you want to go have Chinese food and I want to have Italian food and we're getting dinner, we're in some ways disagreeing, even if we're not making an actual point or anything like that. So the point that I want to make about it is that we want to go from treating disagreement as just a fact of life or a state of being, because we can't do anything about that. That's just the way it is. We want to go from that kind of fatalistic acceptance to saying, well, if we're going to hope to make our differences work for us rather than against us, if we're going to make these conversations productive rather than destructive, then we're going to have to channel it towards the argument as practice, as art, as work, more so than it just as something that visits upon us or just a state of the world that we have to deal with.
Mm-hmm. All right, that sounds good. So you stopped at the point number 2, how to build an argument. And in the book, you actually mentioned 4 stages that you find extremely important. And if I ask people in my seminars, how would you, dear audience, structure an argument? There come many, many ideas, but people cannot agree among themselves what a good argument should look like. And since you are a 2-time debating champion, I assume that you know a thing or two about the elements of a good argument. So maybe you could present those 4 elements to our audience.
For sure. And I'll start with a little bit of framing for it, and maybe we can bring in those 2 holiday goers we were talking about. So it comes from a view that I've come to after having seen thousands of these arguments, that at core, an argument needs to do at least 2 things. The first is it has to show that its main claim is true. And second, that it is important, that it supports the conclusion that you're arguing for. So if Martha is saying, I need to take vacation at this particular time because my child won't have any other opportunities to go on vacation, full stop. In order for that argument to be persuasive, you have to show that first, it is true that the child won't have another opportunity, because if that's not true, then you're not going anywhere with that argument. But second, and I think this is the part that people neglect, you have to show that the fact that Martha's child won't have any other opportunity means Martha should take vacation at this time, as opposed to all the other considerations that Paul or the boss might have that might outweigh the interests of this child getting her vacation when there aren't other opportunities to do so. So those I call the 2 basic burdens of any argument, and they're kind of goalposts for what we need to achieve by the time I've finished making a point. And one quick checklist or structure that helps with that is to make sure that an argument answers the 4 W's. That is, first, what is the point, right? So just the way we start by saying, this is what we're disagreeing about, you want to make it clear to the other side what you're asking for and what point you're making, right? That is Martha saying, hey, I really need to do this because my kid won't have any other opportunities to go on vacation. And often in disagreement, we don't even answer that first question. We sort of talk around the issue. Sometimes we, in the middle of a conversation, discover what the point is. And I might demonstrate that in this interview, but you sort of discover it as you go along. Whereas spelling it out from the beginning makes sure that the other side is listening out for the point that you're actually making, as opposed to just hearing some noise that's vaguely antithetical to what you believe. So you want to say what the point is. Then you want to explain why it's true, right? So give some justification for it. Why is it that the child can't go on vacation at a different time, right? And you might have to provide some evidence or give some reasons why that might be the case. The third W is, when has this happened before? And this is probably a little bit less applicable in this particular argument. But for example, if you're making a point that at work that hiring this kind of person won't be such a good decision for the business, you might give an example of when that has happened before and how the 2 things might be analogous in this instance. So the third question is, when has this happened before? It's an opportunity to give an example or a case study or an analogy. And then the fourth W is to ask, who cares, right? So it's a bit sad to think about asking that about a kid who won't get to go on vacation otherwise. But why should that be the consideration that guides our decision here, as opposed to something else? So you want to say what the argument is, why is it true, when has it happened before, and who cares? And if you've answered those 4 questions, I think you're a lot closer than you might be otherwise to meeting those two burdens of what an argument should be.
All right. And we both know that at the end of a debate, and over a competitive debate at university or high school, there is a judge who sometimes at the first glance doesn't know who has won the argument, but definitely people themselves, or teams as we remember themselves, think, yeah, probably I won, or maybe I came second, but not third or fourth. So everybody seems to have this winner bias where my arguments are perceived as being superior, and the other party's arguments, even if presented well, like we both were at the World Debating Championships, if we see a team from Oxford, we think they were good, but we were slightly better. So now I'm trying to transfer this into the real life example. So imagine, and I want to make it difficult for you, Bo, because you're world champion, you can deal with that. Imagine that both guys, Paul and Martha, have made their cases and have answered your 4 steps. So they say why it's true, that they cannot go otherwise, and why this is important. Normally, of course, they could go to their boss and ask for the decision. And maybe on a normal day, the boss would try to accommodate both needs. And since they have both 2 weeks that are overlapping, he probably would say then try to take 1 week from those 2 weeks, person A, and the other week, person B, and try to find some kind of compromise, because our employees cannot reach the 2-week full agreement. So imagine they both made their case, they both answered those 4 W's. What would be the next step if they proven to each other that they have some plausibility, but they think that their case is more important than the other person's? Should they run to the boss and compromise, or what would be your proposal?
It's a really deep question. I'll give you one more kind of practical exercise, and then I'll try and answer the deeper question. So this is a really deep problem, and one that we see a lot in a polarized world, where even at the end of the discussion, you feel a bit stuck, as in, everybody is quite convinced that they're correct, and there isn't any wriggle room, right? And you feel like you're exactly where you started. And one of the things that debating has developed kind of in response to that is, so much of debating is feeling very certain about what you're arguing for. And, you come up with the best evidence and arguments and support. You try and sell it in the most persuasive way. But in the last moments before the best debaters go into a round, they tend to do something quite amazing, which is they turn to a fresh sheet of paper and try and come up with the best arguments for the other side, right? Or they go through their own case as if through the eyes of the other person and try and spot as many holes as they can find. And I think in that instance of Paul and Martha, after they've given the best accounting for their side, the next and probably final step available to them is to put themselves quite literally in the position of the other side, and come and see the disagreement in a slightly fresh way. And I think often that gives us little rooms to maneuver, and it's not going to work in every instance, but I think it gives us a chance in conversations that feel really stuck. But again, I think the seriousness of your challenge is that even that might not work, right? So we've done that exercise now, and we've tried all of these things to try and make our disagreements work, but we're still kind of stuck. I would say here, we're at the limits of what debating can do and where we need to do something else, right? So debating is, this set of skills is really important, because think about all that we've achieved so far. We've put our arguments on the table. We felt like we've gotten a hearing. We've often improved our own case or clarified our thinking about what we believe in conversation with the other person. But then you might say, now that we've achieved all that, next we have to negotiate, right? Or next we have to submit to a third party authority, as you suggested. But I think the point I would want to make is the things that we've achieved so far in disagreeing well help with all of those things. And the other possibility I would mention is you might think that actually, even if I lose this particular disagreement, I would still prefer that we work out among ourselves, Paul and Martha, through the process of argument, who should get that vacation. Because if we give it to the boss, it'll feel like we weren't able to come to a common understanding, or the judge or the boss probably doesn't know very much about your individual circumstance in the way that you might. So even if it requires some compromise or one person being willing to say, okay, you take this one, that may still be better than putting it in the hands of a boss or some other way of resolving the dispute. So debating and making arguments is not the only way for us to solve our problem, of course, and there are better or worse alternatives. But part of what I'm trying to do is to make the case that in the long run, we are all better off when we resolve our disagreements, not through people's rank in a company or people's clout or their level of extroversion and confidence, but rather we try and focus on the arguments that they're making, because that is what gives us all a chance to be heard and to put our best foot forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you just said was also really interesting, where you kind of wait in those two options to negotiate or to go to the boss and let him or her as a big judge decide. But we also lose a little bit of own agency to resolve our own conflict. Of course, it might seem easier, but it's kind of being a child who's running to the parents and saying, but he started this all. So I really like your interpretation that we rather should, until the end, try to solve it ourselves. We are adults, and by adults I mean everybody who can think, so maybe people with 12 or 10 would also fall under my definition, and not to give it away, because I feel that sometimes people rather choose the easier and fast path to conflict resolution, to escalate it up the hill, but to keep the agency and maybe even negotiate and say, okay, I think I give it to you those 2 weeks. If in return you give it to me next year, that will be like a typical classical compromise without being selfless, giving away our own conflict, and feeling in control and also feeling in power, because I think you can feel in power and lose a conflict at the same time if you are self-confident.
I love that. And I think those are two really key things, right? So one part of being an adult is recognizing other people have needs as well, and that it is within your control to think about how we're going to resolve that disagreement rather than pushing it off. And I think that second part is developing the tools to be able to bring some agency at a time when disagreements feel really disempowering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and my last question, Bo, since I'm also a book author, I have the experience when you write a book like this, you develop a kind of a new idea, or you have a new thought that you haven't had before you started writing this book. So it might be a slightly personal question, but what was your special experience when you finished your book? Did it change you? And if yes, in what way?
That's a really wonderful question. I think for me, I thought some of my experiences were very personal to me. You know, I moved from South Korea to Australia, didn't speak English, found in that structure of debate, in the promise that you'll be heard, an opportunity to find a voice. And I thought, oh, what a particular experience of this immigrant journey, Australia at this particular time. But the more I've toured the book, the more people I've spoken to, I've seen that many of these experiences are quite universal, that the feeling of raising your voice will always feel like a leap of faith. It will always feel like a risk. And my hope is that this set of tools, which I've tried to sharpen and to articulate in the clearest way I can, but is really the received wisdom of generations of people in this community that you and I belong to, that it can make that process easier for people. And that disagreement, which is a source of pain and division, that it can be another way too. That the opposite of bad disagreement need not be agreement. It can be good disagreement. So drawing on some of those universal themes, I'm writing towards that that goal, and that project of making our differences work for and not against us, that's become a lot clearer in my mind as I wrote this book.
Yeah, that sounds like beautiful final words for our interview, and definitely a clear book recommendation, Good Arguments by Bo Seo. You will find the link in the description below. And why I especially like the book is I like books who have a new spin on things. And for me, dealing with conflict and combining that with debating skills was definitely something I haven't read before. I read about debate, I read about conflict, but not using the debate method in solving conflicts. That's why, guys, I really recommend the book. You can download, or you can click on it, not download, but you can click on the link and get it from Amazon. And my very last wish is that all of you viewers, please comment on the experience, on the talks that we had, what you think about the RISA method, what you think about the 4Ws that Bo explained to us. And if you feel that maybe one of your conflicts can be resolved with this method that Bo presented to us. So please free to comment everything that you like, private conflicts, business conflicts, make it anonymous, make it personal, but we are definitely going to enjoy to read what you have written. And Bo, at the end, thanks again so much for taking your time to talk about good arguments.
Thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing from your viewers. Thank you.